Yeah, thank you again for everyone for joining us. What a great way to kick off 2024 with a great cider talk from our head of operations, Kara Taylor. We thought this talk was great not only for reintroducing what yeast could do for cider making, but also with the new laws that are happening in California in 2024 of different licensing types where breweries under the Type 1 or Type 23 license are able to produce ciders and perries. So we just thought a great 101 on cider making would be a great way to start the new year. Anything else on top of that, Kara?
No, I think I can probably get started. I think it's exciting that breweries are going to be allowed to, or it's around the country are able to make different products other than beer because we know that there's a lot more consumers that are conscious of of gluten, which is one of the things that we're able to do with cider. And then also, people are sometimes looking for non-carbonated options or just options that aren't beer.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I was going to say, before we begin this talk, feel free to use the Q&A session to put any questions and answers. And then at the end of this PowerPoint, we'll be able to address some of those questions, answer them right through the webinar. So we'll try to keep a nice active eye out and try to answer along the way as well.
Cool. And so when we were talking about cider, I think a lot of people, their experience with this, if you weren't actively really into cider, is, you're just sort of you've used a little bit of apple juice, you've maybe had something like some treetop, and then you put some yeast in it, and you've got this product now. But ultimately, there's just so many different versions of cider that have existed around the world. And only now, I think in the US, are we seeing some of these different types present themselves, and that there's all these different ways that we can make cider and, all the different flavors. And so, cider is really different from beer. And it's one of the things putting this presentation together that's making me realize that I think this is going to be a more challenging project for a lot of breweries that are interested in transitioning to cider because it's so much more like wine. But, traditionally this is being made with apples or pears, but it can be sparkling or still. Most of the versions in the US are sparkling, but still, especially like in Europe is very common. And I think it's an interesting way to present cider, especially for people that are sensitive to carbonation. But most of these products are not boiled, which is so different from beer, and they're rarely what we would consider to be sterile, like when we boil wort. And so within that, especially with all that fruit, we have many wild yeasts and bacteria that are usually present within those juices and the things that we use to make the must. It's a little bit different in that it's also lower in nitrogen. There are nutrients in the juice, and it really depends also on, where you're getting it, but it's much lower in nitrogen in this way. And so we have to think about it kind of like we do with seltzers rather than beer. And the majority of these sugars are simple sugars. So that makes the fermentations really easy and fast for the yeast. And we have a little bit more options in terms of yeast, in terms of, and we don't need something as robust to be able to make a lot of these ciders. Arrested fermentations are common depending on what kind of sweetness you're looking for. And this isn't something we traditionally do in beer. And so it's something that's closer to wine. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but we can preserve a little bit of that sweetness in order with some arrested fermentations. And then preservatives are commonly used in these products before fermentation and after fermentation. Additionally, that they're really common in a lot of the juices that are used. And so you have to kind of understand the fermentability based on preservatives that are already added just in transport. And then we can look at these as spontaneously fermented or inoculated fermentations. If you think about like what kind of happened in the wine world in the last couple of years about more like natural native wines, these are wines that are primarily spontaneously fermented, and we see a lot of that popping up in cider also. Obviously, it's very similar to beer in that it's difficult to control. And so inoculated fermentations, can be helpful, or, a combo of both there. But one of the things that we see a lot in cider is that yeast doesn't matter. And so all the time it's like, oh, we had this juice and we just added X yeast. I don't remember what it was. It was just some, wine yeast we had around, or, just something cheap. And I think that it's such a misstep in order and to be able to especially invest in some juice, which is typically not inexpensive, and to not think about the fermentation. So, one of the things we know coming from beer is that yeast is transforming that beer into so many different products depending on the yeast strain. And so the same thing is common in ciders. And so in order to transform that apple juice and transform it into a good cider, we also need to think about that fermentation and those yeast choices. So when we're looking at picking the right yeast for a cider, there's a lot of different things to think about. But the first one I would challenge you to think about is, how much residual sugar do you want in that cider? Are you looking for it to be really dry? Are you looking for it to be sweet or semi-sweet? Those are all going to be really important. In beer, we already think about that because with the mash temps, we will always have some residual carbohydrates there, unless we're using enzymes or, some alternative mash steps. But because almost all of the sugars in juice are fermentable by Saccharomyces, we have to think about, how much residual sugar do we want left? You've probably all had a cider that was fermented super, super dry, and that's not always a desired flavor profile. Usually we want just a tiny bit of that sweetness left, and sometimes some people want a lot more of that sweetness left. So thinking about that is an important first step. Additionally, many people have versions of this, but if you're trying the first rendition, you want to, what do you want to target for? Are you going to do something more spontaneous, or are you going to do something more inoculated? And I would say that it really depends on where you're getting juices from. So if it's something that's being pressed at a local farm and transported to you, there's going to be a spontaneous characteristic there, mostly because of there's not a lot of processing. There are ways to be able to get juice that's, more processed and has some preservatives already in it for a cleaner flavor, and that you would inoculate. So thinking about some of those characteristics of what you want. Do you want it to be a little funkier, or do you want it to be cleaner? And then, do you want more of that juice flavor or aroma forward? We have a lot of different yeast choices, and the yeast can contribute to some of that fruitiness, or if you want it to be cleaner and just more juice forward, there's options for that too. So the first ones that we sort of naturally think about are wine yeast, and the majority of these have cleaner flavors and they're acid tolerant, which is important because the pH of these fermentations is lower than we would see in beer. Where most people are not super familiar with a lot of wine yeast, and so I think it's fun in the brewing world transitioning to cider to try about a bunch of beer yeasts. We've done this many times over the years, and through homebrew groups, and using yeast internally, or using yeast to make ciders internally. We know beer yeast can make some unique and fun and delicious ciders. And so really you want to look at some of the attenuation. The attenuation is still going to contribute, those attenuation values in beer are still going to attribute to also in cider. And so if you think of something like using 590, WP 590, the French Saison strain, that's still going to be, an attenuation level that's much higher, a much drier cider than something like our English ale yeast, which is still typically under attenuates most beers and leaves a little bit of sweetness. Bread yeast can be common if you're just doing this at home, but a lot of harsh flavors and definitely not desired. But, there isn't a lot of options called cider yeast. And we do have one, WLP 775 English cider yeast. And we've had that for, 20 plus years. And it makes a really great cider. But in order to be able to look at other options, it's important to look at, these beer and wine yeasts that are available to us. And then I've had such good, delicious ciders that are made with wild yeast and bacteria. Personally, I like the flavors that are coming from more inoculated wild cultures than just leaving it spontaneously. There's a lot of harsh phenols that I find in a lot of the more spontaneous fermentations, and they can be pretty unique, but they can be difficult to control. We'll need to blend them like we do with a lot of other barrel-aged products. And so while I think it can be fun, it's also it's just a little bit more difficult. And I think the flavor is not as approachable to people who are traditionally looking for a cider, maybe at a brewery. So just something to think about there. So what are some popular options? Of course, you can use California ale yeast. Some of my favorites are the English ale yeast and the Scottish ale yeast. Both of these lend to a little bit fruitier characteristic, but it also leaves some of that residual sweetness there, and so it doesn't dry out that beer completely. Several years ago, we made a Scottish cider yeast blend that basically took some of the components of all the things that we liked and put that together to make this yeast blend. And then, of course, I was talking about before that English cider yeast, which is also, a lot of these are, or all of these are Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Belgian and Saison strains are popular also to add to some of these, and they will dry those ciders out a lot. So if you're looking for something that's more like champagne style, where it's highly carbonated and very dry, those are really great strains to be able to use. There's still a lot of that fruitiness there. But we still have some of the phenols. And so we don't have ferulic acid, which is, what phenols use to convert, or what yeast uses to convert into phenols. But we do have hydroxycinematic acid. And this acid is being converted also to phenols. And so sometimes you can get, like I was talking about, that plasticky character from some of those wild yeasts, but you will have some of that that phenol character from Saison and Belgian strains also if you use them in cider. It's in a lower quantity, so it's not nearly as high as we see in beer, but they still will be present. So our wine yeast, they're often Saccharomyces bayonis, and there's a lot of commercial options that are dry and liquid. They're typically more flavor neutral and acid tolerant. And you're going to see some of the marketing on them as low sulfur producing. So the sulfur is a big component of when nitrogen is low, and that's common in wine and it's common in cider. And so some of these yeasts have been chosen as low sulfur producers so that we don't have that sort of rotten egg or matchstick aroma that's happening because of the low nitrogen there. A common yeast from our wine catalog is 715, the champagne yeast. And so, there are some things there that you can mess around with, but again, they're usually going to also have a high level of dryness. So when we're looking at cider, if we're looking at something that you want to do a little bit funkier, there's a lot of species of yeast that are found in cider. Pichia, Saccharomyces, Wickerhannemyces, Brett, Torlospora. These are all very common, and a lot of these are actually, they can be found in beer, but because they don't typically consume maltose, we don't find them to be is common. But a lot of this yeast is coming from the apples, but there's a lot of research showing that there's as much yeast and organisms coming from the fruit then also the press. And so because a lot of these things are not sanitized, batch to batch, there's a lot of organisms that are on the equipment, and that is contributing to that fermentation also. This is often resulting in stuck fermentations because we have to have all the conditions right, the right amount of organisms for these spontaneous fermentations. So it is common to have yeast a backup if you need to be able to finish that out or to co-inoculate something. But years ago, our team had isolated some yeast off of apples in an island off of Denmark. And so we had coined that many years ago, the new Nordic yeast blend, which is WLP 611. And this does have an organism like Tortospora in it. It's maltose negative. So that means if you were to have it in beer, it wouldn't ferment it. But it does allow a sort of wild characteristic with an inoculated culture with something like cider. And you can have it in your brewery and not worry about it, something like Brettanomyces. If you're thinking about wanting to take some of the same characteristics you like from Brett in beer, we do have some cultures of Brettanomyces, sac, and lacto combined. And one of them is the funky cider blend. Additionally, that to make something funkier, you can use that new Nordic yeast blend. But these pitching rates are going to be important because it's very similar to beer, right? The funk is going to increase as the cultures are pitched on the lower side, and we get more growth and we get more of that funkiness. So same principles that apply here as they do in beer for that in terms of pitching rates and funk level of funk. Does juice type matter? So I will say yes. I will put a caveat, and this is not my expertise in terms of juice, but I do think that there are differences in quality and flavor. But really what you want to really pay attention to is, what type of apples. So not all apple juice is great for cider, but looking out for preservatives such as sodium benzoate. A lot of these products have sodium benzoate, and if we dilute some of that concentrate, those preservatives will also be diluted. But some of those, if they're in high amounts, could stall those fermentations. It could mess with your pitch rate. And then also, if it's completely fresh, it might already be fermenting on the way over. There's usually potassium metabisulfate that's added sometimes in order to reduce those lower inoculates of things that we don't want. So, those are things to think about when purchasing juice. And so I mentioned before that apple juice is a poor medium for yeast health. And when it has a low starting pH, it's just not great for yeast in general. But it also has low nutrients, low nitrogen availability. And so we want to think about the same way we would maybe with wine as we would for this type of product. And you'll see this usually written on, if you're looking at any type of cider making or wine making materials, they're going to talk about it as yan, and we're in beer usually calling it fan. So they're referring to it as yeast assimilable nitrogen, and we call it free amino nitrogen, but this is typically the same measurement here. Ideally, we want it to be 140 to 200 parts per million, and naturally, depending on the juice source, it's going to be anywhere from 40 to 150. You can probably imagine that the more processed that juice is, or have to do something from concentrate, it's likely going to have less nitrogen in it, unless it's being fortified of some sort. So it's important to invest in those nutrients. I recommend our Seltzer Max, which within the name is called Seltzer Max, but ultimately can be used for the same purpose. It contains DAP in it, diammonium phosphate, and that will really help those fermentations without having to add a ton of nutrient that might be contributing to some, to the flavor profile, since it's a little bit more delicate than something like wine or beer. And the FanMax Bio, which does not contain DAP, but has other peptones in it, is another good source if you're looking to avoid DAP there. Both of those, we have pitching rates on our pitching rate calculators on our website. But ultimately, you kind of have to mess around with this you have to understand your nitrogen, your starting nitrogen, so that you know how much to add. And this is going to help you avoid those sulfur characteristics that you might have to scrub out later if you have those in the fermentation. Okay, so we've got easy available sugars in these fermentations: glucose, sucrose, fructose. A lot of people want to know about temperature. I would say a lot of people making cider, they don't have a lot of temperature control on these fermentations. Some that have kind of transitioned from the brewing world, I think now have a lot more temperature control. But I would say that, the max temp for making good flavors and aromas is around 75 Fahrenheit for most of these strains, to reduce some of those fusels. Of course, there's probably several exceptions, for that, in terms of strains that will still make good flavors. But, the hotter the fermentation, if you do want to cold crash it, trying to keep some of that residual sugar, it will take more energy and it might be a little bit harder. And so it's common to be able to cold crash. And so we keep that some residual sugar, but that means we have to get that yeast off of there. Even if it's cold and we still have a decent amount of yeast and sugar, you're going to have some re-fermentation there. And so we've got to, filter and get that yeast off of that product. And then the next thing I'll go into detail a little bit more is that we've got pitching rates are much lower than in beer. And so typically, traditionally, about 1/3 of typical, the pitching rate is about 1/3 of typical brewing rate. So it's very similar to wine. And one of the reasons for this is that it's much more fermentable. So we've got really easily fermented sugars. They could be a lower ABV concentration depending on what you're starting with. So, if you're just doing a 5 or 6% cider, you might have a lower initial sugar concentrations. But a lot of people believe in that traditionally they're looking for a longer and slower fermentation. And this is basically, if we have a really active fermentation, we are driving those flavors and aromas of the juice off. It's similar, if you think about it, with sometimes we talk about that in terms of hops, where you're trying to contain some of those aromas instead of blowing them off by a really active fermentation. So this is not always everyone's strategy, but I would say from a traditional standpoint, that is the faster the fermentation is not always what people are looking for here. And this allows you to basically be able to, purchase a little bit less yeast, or use a little bit less yeast in these fermentations. And that's important because a lot of times we can't repitch them. And we have seen recently a lot of repitching success. And I think this is going to vary from strain to strain. Some of these strains are going to be more acid tolerant. It's also obviously going to depend on how you're harvesting that yeast. And I think basically, if you are removing that yeast in an appropriate amount of time, we have seen that, after first, second generation, we're still looking at 95% viability at the end of those fermentations, which is great. And these were done with some of our ale strains. But this might be because if we're doing these low pitch rates, we're going to get more growth. And so it's like when you're trying to sort of revive a culture, you use less yeast, and so that you can get a lot of new growth instead of using older yeast. And so if we use a bunch of older yeast that was a little stressed out, we might see those generations continue, whereas in that low pitch rate will help us get more growth there. So we have seen a lot of success with repitching yeast. The nitrogen availability is going to be really important to think about. If these strains are stressed already, they're going to produce more sulfur. Even if the viability looks, pretty good, if you don't have that nitrogen availability there, the viability is likely going to start plummeting pretty quickly. And then after that fermentation's done, there are people that like to do a malolactic fermentation, and this is converting the harsher malic acid to a lactic acid, very common in wine, also can happen in cider. And this can also happen naturally because there is a bacterial species called Enococcus, and it occurs naturally on a lot of these fruits. And so it will happen at the end of the fermentation and it softens up that cider or that wine. And we do have a malolactic culture in-house that we sell in order to sort of make that process happen quicker. But it is usually a desired characteristic, and also that's where a lot of that like buttery character comes from. In Chardonnay is a large malolactic conversion there. And so you'll also have a little bit of that depending on how much conversion you get. So a little bit different mouthfeel. And then, once that fermentation's done, we also have to think about preservatives in these products, and either by keeping them very cold, so that arrested fermentation. It's very common to use potassium metabisulfate or Campton tablets that usually have a cleaner flavor. Potassium sorbate is used, ascorbic acid, and then filtration. And all of these are going to have some added flavor, and they're all going to have also legal limits for some of these things. So it is important to make sure that you're looking at that stuff. I personally am not an expert in these, in terms of these preservatives, but we do a lot of testing for total and free SO2, and that's typically in order to understand, how that product can age and be stable in a bottle or can. And if there's any kind of, microbial issues. So in summary, these fermentations are a lot more similar to wine than they are to beer. And so I would encourage you to start thinking about that way, start looking at different resources in that direction than, treating it just like beer. And then think about what kind of product or products you want to design, and that will help designate what kind of yeast will be appropriate for that. So in terms of usually about sweetness and, flavor and aroma. I think experimenting with different yeast, especially in cider, is really easy, especially because we have access to juice and we don't have to boil and sanitize and do all these things. Of course, we recommend sanitizing, any fermenter that you're using, but it's just a little bit easier for us to play around with different yeast to kind of figure out what you're going for. Additionally, I would, try to invest in nutrient additions and messing around with that so that you have an understanding of where you need to hit for those appropriate, so you can reduce that level of sulfur there. And if you are going to do this more long-term than just maybe a one-off, it's very common in wineries to have, the ability to test these things. And so looking at a lab setup or getting this tested outside at third party to analyze total and free SO2, pH and gravities. And you can even measure, malic acid conversion if that's something you're looking at too. So with that, I will take some questions. We also do have 2 kits that we've designed specifically around from this talk, but that will are basically sample trials. So if you're interested in either of these, the first one comes with California Ale, our dry version, Scottish cider yeast, and then English cider yeast. And the 773 is the blend. And then it also comes with some yeast nutrients, so you can add that there. And then the cider kit number 2 is our English ale yeast, the Scottish ale yeast, and then the funky cider blend, additionally with that yeast nutrient. So if you're interested in those, you can just contact our info box, info@whitelabs.com, in order to order them. Yeah, and then I will look at questions. So Devin, did you want to kind of like toss them to me?
Yeah, thank you again for this talk, Kara. I thought it was very, very informal. We do have a couple questions. Again, feel free to use that Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom feature to ask some questions. I think first off, we'll go into the role of with apple juice being introduced into your brewery. What sort of concerns do we have for like contamination? Would you recommend using different hosings, almost like using a wild culture for cider making versus beer making?
Yeah, I think you're going to want to think about it in the same way. If you're doing something more spontaneous or if you're doing something more funky, I would treat it the same way that you would in beer. Um, I think if you're just doing something clean, but you're not, the juice might not be 100% sterile. Typically, the organisms that we see in there are maltose negative, and so they're not going to consume maltose. These are a lot of the strains we're using in non-alcoholic beers. And so you don't have to worry as much, or really at all when you're using those, because they either get outcompete by Saccharomyces and your traditional beer, or they just won't survive because they don't consume maltose and those larger sugars. But if you are going like the funkier route, you might want to keep, some of anything that's silicone or plastics, separate there.
Cool, yeah. And then going off that funky route, I've also seen people using Camden tablets beforehand to almost inhibit some of the wild yeast from getting outcompeted from that lower pitch rate from sac yeast. Do you have like a recommended like pitch timeline, or if they are using some of that metabisulfites?
Yeah, it's common to use some of those if you're, especially with the low pitch rate, right? So if we're adding a lower amount of yeast, there's more time for other organisms to outcompete than when we look at pitch rates for beer. And so if it really depends on the juice source. If you're buying it from a commercial source, they're usually going to have some guidance for you on that. If you're getting it from a local farm, I would say that it's probably going to be the dirtiest that you're going to see. And so using something like potassium metabisulfite or Camden tablets at the beginning to inhibit that is going to be important. And you'd have to do that relatively quick versus doing that than waiting, because even if you put it in the fridge or in the cold box, you're likely going to see some activity there.
Nice. The sooner the better. And then I guess it goes now for at the end for like shelf life and everything. What are your thoughts on pasteurizations, like tunnel, flash, any preference or routes to go for shelf life?
I saw that in the Q&A. So pasteurizing, I'm not super familiar on like what larger companies are doing in terms of that, but typically it needs to be fast. It needs to be, and I would say that, the bioload in terms of how much yeast is in there has got to be low, because, there's a reason we don't boil the juice. It really changes a lot of the flavors. And so, we want it to be the least heat intensive as possible, but obviously we can use pasteurization in order to kill many things. So I'm sure it's acceptable. I just don't know how it changes the flavor.
So you would recommend some sort of like centrifuge or something to get the yeast off before running it through like a tunnel
typically before you're gonna take that product and you're going to remove the yeast if you're commercially packaging it. But many people just use potassium metabisulfate to keep it stable. Something like a can, less likely. You're probably going to use some kind of flash or tunnel pasteurizer.
Nice.
And then I saw this. Yeah, I saw the comment from Josh.
Yeah. So the question was that Josh has brewed a local batch of cider with WLP, and he's done this a few times with great success. The last batch he had was a sulfur bomb, so that's sort of like off flavor. He never used nutrients before, so maybe he should have. Do you think sulfur is like a big number one like off flavor for cider making?
Yeah, and the reason so when you said you hadn't used the nutrients before, but maybe you should have, what happens is that every time you receive juice or you use juice or use a different kind of juice, the nitrogen levels are going to be different. And so if you think about harvest time at a winery, they're actively constantly checking the nitrogen levels to see how much nitrogen that they need to add. They don't just say, oh, well, last year we added 150 grams per hectoliter, so that's what we're going to do again this year. They're constantly monitoring those things. And so it is a good idea to have a good understanding of the quality of juice that you're receiving. And some providers might provide that for you. But a lot of people do that in-house.
Yeah, we just did a question of what's the most cost-effective way to test for yan. But
For
I
Yan
think so.
in-house.
Yeah.
So there are, I'm not familiar with a lot of the technologies like personally, but there's definitely some more cost-effective wine analyzers that are on the market. And any of those wine analyzers that are doing some of these enzymatic tests, you could use to test for Yan. You can also do it for malic acid. But there's a lot more wine analyzers, mainly because they need to do it in real time versus needing to do it, and then getting your results back a week later. They're doing it, sometimes in the middle of the night as they're harvesting. So I would look at some wine analyzers, and you could be able to do that in-house.
So making sure our must is at a certain nutrient nitrogen threshold to make sure it gets proper fermentation, as it's going to change from harvest level, variety to variety. What if we are repitching that yeast? Would you recommend adding nitrogen every time for every batch?
Yes. All of the experience that we've done, we've added nitrogen, and I would say even for the repitching, it's even more important to use nutrients there because the yeast is just a little bit more stressed than we would love.
And then seems like our last question was thoughts on UV pasteurization. Does radiation affect cider flavors like it does beer?
Unfortunately, that's not something I'm super familiar with, but I don't think UV pasteurization works super well in beer with the high bioload. We've looked at some of that kind of stuff before, but unfortunately, that's just not my expertise. So,
And then, oh, someone just asked, can wine analyzers be used to measure FAN for wort too? I believe so. A lot of times FAN, the way they refer to it is PAN, or primary amino nitrogen. Yan is just a combination of PAN plus the inorganic, or DAP. So there's the equation for organic nitrogen, FAN, and inorganic, which creates the Yan value.
yeah, and so most of the kits, if you Google, like if you're looking for these wine kits, they're going to say pan, and that's what you're looking for. Yeah, to do the same thing for wort.
Yeah,
Cool.
cool. If not, oh, I guess one more. Oh, I guess there is also a last question on arrested fermentation. Do you suggest crash cooling before fermentation ends to control sweetness?
I think that crash cooling can be really beneficial if you can get the yeast off of the juice essentially at the whatever you're fermenting as soon as possible, because we know even if it's low, it takes a long time to kind of crash that down, and so it's hard to control between once the glycol is set and how much fermentation is going to happen in between that, and then getting it really cold. And then you've got to get that yeast off so it doesn't continue to ferment. But this is a very common method that wineries use in order to control sweetness. And then they're adding preservatives so that any residual yeast or yeast that it comes in contact with doesn't, make an exploding bottle. But it's not unheard of. It's sort of a way to think of, adding a bunch of fruit though to a beer. If you've got active yeast in there, it's a nightmare, right? So we want the product to be a little bit more stable, and so that's where those preservatives come into play.
So yeah, so it really depends on their glycol system of how quickly it cools, as it's still going to ferment down. So maybe creating some sort of like timeline of like stopping fermentation a couple platos before, and then adding those preservatives to to help mitigate.
Yeah. And being able to get that yeast off appropriately.
Sounds good. Cool. I believe that
Cool.
is all our questions for today. Feel free, if you have any other questions, to send them to education@whitelabs.com, and we'll be sure to answer them and follow up. Be also on the lookout for any more topics and webinars that we might be talking about. So feel free to send us ideas as well for the 2024 season. But again, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Kara, for this very, very informational talk on cider making.
Thanks.
Everyone have a good day.